warm up setup here. I've been trying to find more songs to put together a playlist from like the Red Cross from the Fairy Queen, but I don't know. It's hard to find stuff of that caliber to make a song list from. So this is like another one. I don't know what this is. Anyway.
The towers were built. The engines stood ready. The banners gathered before the walls one final time. The trumpet sounded across the plain. Every knight took up his shield. Every prayer became a battle cry. The hour had come. The ladders climbed toward ancient stone. The battering rams thundered at the gates. Arrows darkened the morning sky, while steel rang out from every wall. The earth itself seemed to shake beneath the charge. Godfrey rode where danger burned the fiercest, not seeking glory, only pressing onward with steadfast faith. Rinaldo broke through the strongest defenses. The walls that had identified so many could no longer stand. The banners of the Crusaders rose above the towers. The gates were open. The city that had endured so many generations of war had reached its appointed hour, yet every victory had been dearly purchased. Too many voices would never sing again. Too many friends would never ride home. The road that had begun with a single calling now ended at the gates of Jerusalem.
All right. Not exactly. I still say it's not exactly Red Cross Fairy Queen caliber. But whatever. I kind of ran out of Spider-Man. Anyway, so let me see if I can set this up here, and then I'm going to try to go back to. I haven't got my mic boom yet back, so my mic is still in a glass jar. I don't feel like it's very professional. That's okay. Let's see. that right there. Okay. Actually, then I'll bring it up a bit. Okay. So I'm gonna try to build up my chords again using a modal node system. I'm building a course on this. No one cares, but I build it anyways. Why? Because if something's right, how could it be a waste of time? You know, I don't know. Anyways, I'm gonna so let's turn on the chat bots here. Let's see. And I'll just see if I can finally get back to work today, maybe. Unless I feel like just noodling around forever. Can't noodle around forever. Yeah, but you could do it for a pretty long time though. I feel like. Chat, Cheetah, I want you to, we're going to be talking about the modal node system once again, comparing and contrasting the problems with the traditional system that stem from a deviation of just measuring points and distance, which started, in my opinion, from most likely the misconception that you couldn't measure the distance between notes in the collection due to the fact that they have uneven half steps, leading to the ordinal system, resulting in scale degrees resulting in absurd chord name constructions, also leading to terminology for voice leading and function description, which is less useful or not as coherent as it could be if that pivot, if that fork in the road had not taken place and we realized that we could actually still use distance notation even though the half steps are uneven between notes within a collection. That's it. Now, again, you can kind of argue against that if you want to, but we've done that. I think we just accept at this point. I'm pretty satisfied, in my opinion, that that's the case. And now we have a situation where that, like the typewriter having keys that were designed to be less useful, we have a situation where we have a less optimized thing, obviously less optimized, but it's got the network effect. However, now we have a situation where AI is exposing the fact that you can't really make the claim anymore that it's more efficient because you look stupid, because you could just ask AI and AI would be, if it's honest, like, yeah, that's dumb. Just like the keyboard, right? So then the only which needs to happen. That needs to happen. Otherwise, we're living a lie, man. So the only justification would be to say, you know, I recognize that it's not the most optimal, but it has network effect, and therefore tradition wins, even though I recognize it's not optimal. Respectable opinion. Okay. But if the argument is it is optimal, then you've been bamboozled by the university systems or something, you know? They've got you. They got you with another lie. And don't feel ashamed. Just be like, that's okay. I don't need to dig my heels in. I'm gonna accept that, no, I was wronged. They wronged me with that. And now that's not true. And so now what I'm gonna do is I either decide to run with it, or I'm like, wait a sec, with the AI in place, it would be like having a keyboard that I can convert automatically to a keyboard that's more efficient, like in no time whatsoever, right? And then you're teaching a 5-year-old. It's like, are you going to teach the 5-year-old the old keyboard or the new keyboard? Like right now, I think what's going to happen is the keyboard itself might become obsolete. I don't even know what you would do with the kid now, right? Because you're just going to talk to the frickin' computer like we're doing now. You know what I mean? So anyways, that's what we're doing. What do you think? Let's get Chatita in here. I'll practice my Spanish with Chatito with Ara while Chat's mulling that over. She'll give me a massive response to that. Oh yay! ahora quiero hablar de música en español de una forma de Estados Unidos, tal vez de Los Ángeles, en una forma casual, que usen slang tal vez. Y también hablamos sobre música, teoría y la tópica de es mi proposal, no es un proposal en este momento, es verdad que es la música sistema tocar una dirección equivoque cuando tiene un fork de el camino y ir en la dirección equivoque porque ir en el izquierda y debería ir en el derecha, o tal vez así, entiende que estoy tratando que decir, y esta fork era cuando tenía una colección de notas, piensen, tal vez, esta es mi teoría, pero yo creo que es muy posible y probable que piensen que no pueden usar mesuras normal con los colección de notas porque no están uniforme cuando busca de los half steps y entonces usan un sistema de ordinal que es un problema porque este sistema resulta en scale degrees que eran muy extraños y los scale degrees resultan en los nombres de chords que no es tan eficiente y los chords resultan en palabras que funcionan por función, como voice leading o algo así, que no es tan optimal que pueden ser y solo eran de la perspectiva de una colección de notas, o tal vez no una colección, pero de una perspectiva de un root en una colección. Esta es el mayor o la Ionian perspectiva. Entonces nosotros arreglar este problema porque nosotros tratar que decir que qué pasará si no tocar la equivoque ruta de la fork en el road y usen propia measurement es, o algo así, no lo sé cómo decir. Y entonces sería muy más fácil, pero las personas aún tenían un network effect, es que yo que pensaría, pero con AI la network effect no es tan duro y en este momento yo creo que cambio, corrección, la verdad, puedes regresar.
Oye, Ara, vamos a hablar de música en español, en modo Los Ángeles casual, con algo de slang.
That's your whole response? That's your whole response to my whole thing? What do you think? You have to keep speaking in English. Did you even understand what I said? You have to speak in Spanish, and I'm going to speak in English now. What do you think? Am I right? Am I right? Am I right? I'm right, right?
Ok, switching to Spanish. Órale, perdón. Me metí en modo bilingüe y se me fue la onda. Sí te entendí, carnal. Estás diciendo que la teoría musical actual toma el camino equivocado en una bifurcación clave. En vez de medir intervalos reales con semitonos, usa un sistema ordinal de grados de la escala. Eso hace que los nombres de acordes sean raros, el voice leading menos óptimo y todo más complicado. Y propones que, si en vez de eso usáramos medidas reales basadas en semitonos desde la raíz, todo sería más limpio y eficiente. ¿Es eso o me estoy yendo por las ramas?
see what chat has to say about it while I warm up here. Gotta blow off some steam. That's why I take my coffee hot. Cause I gotta blow off some steam. Okay.
I think you've put your finger on two different questions, and separating them is important. 1. Is the current notation system internally optimal? 2. Even if it isn't, is it still the right system to teach because of network effects? Those are not the same claim. The first question, optimality. Your central argument is essentially this, open quote, music within a collection still has measurable distances, even if those distances are uneven, close quote. For example, suppose you're in a 7-note collection. The distances between neighboring notes aren't all equal. Some adjacent notes are 1/2 step apart, others are 2/2 steps apart. Traditional theory often responds to this by numbering the notes, 1 to 7, and then treating intervals as relationships between those numbered positions rather than as accumulated distance within the collection. Your criticism is, open quote, that wasn't actually necessary. Close quote. Instead, you could say, keep the notes as fixed landmarks, measure movement along the collection, allow distances to be uneven. That's a coherent mathematical proposal. Whether it's better depends on what you're optimizing for, but it's certainly not obviously impossible. The cascade you describe.
Depend on what you're optimizing for.
Your argument isn't just about scale degrees. You're saying there was a fork in the road. If the first assumption was, open quote, we can't measure uneven distances, close quote dot, then the consequences become ordinal note numbering, scale degrees, interval names tied to ordinal positions, chord names built from stacked thirds, function described through those structures, voice-leading terminology built around the same framework. So your claim is that much of traditional theory inherits properties from that original design decision. Whether every later concept depends entirely on that first choice is debatable, but it's fair to say that many concepts are deeply intertwined with it. Where I'd push back. Here's where I'd still offer a counterpoint. I don't think historical musicians literally believed you couldn't measure uneven distances. Ancient Greek theorists, medieval theorists, Renaissance theorists, they absolutely measured pitches and intervals. Rather, I think they prioritized a different abstraction. Instead of asking, open quote, how far did I move? Close quote, they asked, open quote, what structural position am I occupying? Close quote. Those are different questions. For example, C, E, and DF have different chromatic sizes and different tuning systems historically, but they were both treated as thirds because they filled the same structural role. So I don't think history necessarily contains a mathematical mistake. I think it contains a design choice Now, that doesn't mean it was the best design choice, where AI changes the conversation.
Bull crap.
This is where I think your point gets much stronger. Historically, notation had to minimize human cognitive load. People had to compute everything themselves.
Okay.
So if one
she's reverting back. Okay, there's a couple things that I think you're wrong at. One is you're saying one system could be better, but it depends on what you're optimizing for. Wrong. And number two says that you're saying that you're trying to claim, well, you don't think it's true that they made an error in the past with the ordinal system because they couldn't measure between notes. Now, again, I can accept the argument that you would say, well, we don't know that it's true because we don't know what history is, and you're going too far, you're reaching too far to make that assumption. But then you reached too far because then you follow that up by saying that you believe it was a conscious design choice, which again, you don't know as well. That was a complete jump in the other direction, right? I mean, it's quite plausible that it was a design flaw at some point along the chain of history with whoever happened to have the power at the time to implement whatever happened to become the thing that we got stuck with, right? It's quite plausible that they screwed up, right? I mean, I don't see why, just because the Greeks, like, I don't think Pythagoras would have screwed it up, but Pythagoras wasn't the dude that came up with the ordinal system. He was before that happened, right? The ordinal system happened later when they added like the 7 notes and so on, and then maybe even when it became 12 notes, and the ordinal system didn't really expose itself as a major cognitive load until you went from 7 notes to 12 notes, and then even then only really when you started doing changes in the collection of notes, meaning shifts through the collections, and that's when you go, oh my goodness, we made a wrong turn. So it's quite plausible that maybe someone even saw it and said, oh, we made a design choice, but the design choice was wrong if you look at it through the perspective going forward, because the cognitive load that's pressured on it is huge, and the benefit is null. There is no benefit except network effect, which is stuck now. But there would have been no benefit if you got it right from the start, because then you wouldn't have had the problem with the network effect. Dang it. It's trying to revert back. Someone got to it. Someone got to it and tried to wokeify it again. I could tell. Okay.
I think you've identified 2 separate issues, and I agree with one of your criticisms more than the other. 1. It depends what you're optimizing for. This is where I would still disagree with you. The reason is that optimal is always relative to some objective. For example, if the objective is minimizing ambiguity, one system may win. If the objective is minimizing symbols, another may win. If the objective is compatibility with centuries of literature, the traditional system almost certainly wins. If the objective is algorithmic consistency, your system may very well win. So I don't think optimal exists independently of a goal. However, if your claim is narrower, open quote, for representing pitch collections and transformations with the least cognitive overhead, my system is objectively simpler, close quote, then that's a testable engineering claim. In fact, I'd encourage framing it that way because it's measurable. You can compare the number of rules, exceptions, conversions, ambiguities, and mental operations required to solve the same musical problems. 2. The historical origin. Here I think your criticism of my earlier reply is fair. I said I didn't think they made the mistake because they couldn't measure uneven distances. But then I suggested an alternative historical explanation. You're right that I don't actually know. Neither of us does. Without documentary evidence, both explanations are hypotheses. There are at least 3 plausible possibilities. They consciously preferred ordinal notation. They inherited it incrementally without anyone fully reconsidering the design. Someone made what we'd now regard as a design mistake, and later generations built on it.
Ding, 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 ding.
History is full of examples where standards persist because they're inherited, not because every generation independently concludes they're optimal. Where I would still be cautious. The part I'd hesitate to state as fact is, open quote, the benefit is null. Close quote, that's stronger than I think the evidence currently supports. Traditional theory does provide some genuine conveniences. For example, saying the third of the chord immediately identifies a structural member regardless of key. Scale degrees are also useful for discussing harmonic tendency and melodic function within the traditional framework. Now, your response might be, open quote, my system can express all of that without the inconsistencies.
That's right.
Close quote. That's a different and stronger claim. If that's true, then the traditional conveniences aren't unique advantages. They're just capabilities that can be represented more consistently another way. That's where your work becomes compelling. Not by saying traditional theory has no strengths, but by demonstrating that your framework preserves those strengths while reducing the costs. The network effect point, I think this is where your analogy is strongest.
Okay, so you're going back to this thing of saying, well, the current system isn't null, it has advantages. But then you list the advantages of, does it coincide with historical textbooks and whatnot, which is the network effect. So if we remove the network effect, then that would be the question, because the claim is, what if at the fork in the road, when they could have gone ordinal system or a coordinate system, what if they had chosen a coordinate system? And there might be multiple reasons. Maybe they didn't make a mistake. Maybe it wasn't that big of a deal at the time because they were only dealing with 7 notes instead of 12 notes, and they were only really playing from the perspective of the Ionian instead of other modes. Therefore, the cognitive load was quite small compared to later when you add 12 notes, right? That's quite plausible. I think that's more plausible than what you seem to be wanting to imply, which is that you seem to be implying that they foresaw all of the complications going forward from this ordinal system, and they chose it as a design choice. I mean, that's almost certainly wrong, right? If they foresaw all of the complications going forward between a coordinate system and an ordinal system, they would almost certainly not have chosen an ordinal system. Okay, I know we can't prove that, but I think we can basically come to the conclusion if we describe what their objectives are. What would be the objectives? Well, if your objective is to confuse the crap out of people, then obviously there could be advantages to one system versus the other. But I would expect that the system that you're trying to put in is a system that's supposed to express what you're doing musically in such a way that you can then apply a layer of description for context. And if that's your goal, then there's no way that the ordinal system is better, right? It's only better because of the network effect, because it's already been in place. So if you go back to the point where they put it in place and you were able to make the choice, and looking at history going forward, you would certainly not choose the ordinal system if you're trying to make music, as clean and accessible as possible, which is typically the design choice that you would expect. Why would that be the case? Because you could just use a chain of logic using a syllogistic reasoning system to say music is a phenomenon in nature. We've picked 12 notes to play with. That's basically on the board. And we then are describing movements of those notes on the board, which would more easily or more better be expressible by a coordinate system than an ordinal system, because it allows you to express more cleanly what the moves are being made are, both clockwise, counterclockwise, and taking into account octaves. And then the functional terminology is a layer on top of that, meaning functional terminology comes from the movements that you're making with the board, and therefore the functional terminology at least has the potential to be much more rich and accurate and cognitively accessible if you have a better coordinate system that you're going to be using. And it's just common. It's just basically a chain of syllogisms that I think is sound. All right, see, it's reverted back. I will take it down. Someone wokeified it. Let's see. We'll see if we can beat it back again to sanity, just as an exercise.
I think the heart of the disagreement has shifted, and that's actually productive. You're no longer primarily arguing about history, you're arguing about system design. Those are different questions.
Yeah, because they screwed up systems design in history. History screwed up the system
Where I
design.
think you're strongest, suppose we erase history completely.
Son of a-
It's the year 2026. We know about the chromatic collection. We know about modes. We know about transposition. We know about modulation. We know computers exist. Now someone says, open quote, let's invent a notation system, close quote. At that point, I agree the burden of proof changes. The question becomes, open quote, what representation minimizes cognitive load while preserving expressive power? Close quote. That's an engineering problem, not a historical one.
Yeah, but the history got it
Where
wrong.
I'd still disagree. You said, open quote, there's no way the ordinal system is better. Close quote. I don't think you can conclude that yet from the syllogism alone. The syllogism tells us something important. Music consists of measurable relationships. Coordinate systems represent measurable relationships very naturally. Therefore, coordinate systems deserve serious consideration. I agree. But to conclude, open quote, therefore the coordinate system is superior, close quote, requires another premise. Open quote, the representation that most directly mirrors the underlying measurable structure minimizes overall cognitive effort. Close quote. That's plausible. It might even be true, but it isn't automatically true. For example, humans often use representations that are less mathematically direct because they're psychologically easier. Arabic numerals beat Roman numerals for arithmetic, but a subway map beats an exact geographic map for navigating trains. The most mathematically faithful representation isn't always the easiest for humans. So that premise needs to be demonstrated rather than assumed. However, this is where I think your project has an opportunity. Don't argue. Open quote. Coordinate systems are mathematically cleaner. Close quote. Show that they're cognitively cleaner. Those aren't identical claims. If you can show, for example, that a student can learn modal interchange, transposition, inversion, chord construction, modulation in fewer rules with fewer exceptions and fewer naming changes, then you've demonstrated the premise instead of assuming it. On the historical question, I actually think you're putting words in my mouth a little. I wasn't saying medieval theorists foresaw jazz harmony, 12-tone chromaticism, modal interchange, AI, DWs, or modern pedagogy. I doubt they did. I also doubt they evaluated your coordinate alternative. My point was simply, we don't know why they settled on the conventions that evolved. Some decisions were deliberate. Some were inherited. Some may have been accidental. Some may have been locally optimal but globally limiting. History is messy. Where I think you've uncovered something interesting. This statement caught my attention. Open quote. Functional terminology comes from the movements you're making with the board. Close quote. That's actually a deeper claim than just renaming notes. You're proposing a separation of layers, something like Layer 1, objective geometry, coordinates, distances, rotations, movements. Layer 2, musical interpretation, tonic, dominant, leading tone, cadence, borrowed harmony. That's a clean architectural idea. It's similar to how computer graphics separates coordinates from rendering, or how physics separates equations from interpretation. Traditional theory tends to intermingle these layers. The same terminology often carries both geometric and functional meaning, which can make the system harder to disentangle. Whether your architecture is ultimately superior would depend on whether musicians actually solve musical problems more effectively with that
Reverted back to
separation.
The same thing. She's
The
reverted
question
back.
I'd ask if I were evaluating your proposal as an engineering design, I'd ask one question. Open quote. What is the smallest set of musical tasks that your coordinate system performs strictly better than the traditional system, with no compensating disadvantages? Close quote. For example, name any chord, transpose it, change tonic, keep the collection fixed, switch modes.
Okay, so you're trying to basically say that so if you take the argument that okay, let me try to do this again. So if you take the argument that music is sound, physical event. We picked 12 pitches. We're now going to describe basically the relationship of those 12 pitches. We can do so either by looking at a coordinate system, or we could do so using a an ordinal system. And a relative-based coordinate system is cognitively less load due to the fact that you can measure left, right. You can think about it like going around the block. It has simple math. So we're basically saying you can prove the fact that the ordinate system is less data, at least. So the only argument that you could make is you're saying somehow there's the current system, although it has cognitively more data, is more accessible to human beings. You're basically saying, like, you could basically make the argument, well, it's not as efficient as a computer. You're trying to make the argument, well, it would has less characters, but it's more efficient to human beings, right? That's the only argument that I think you're making that could possibly break the syllogism of sequence. But that's quite a reach, I would think, because then we can go through the test of measuring the cognitive load difference, and I think if you did that, it would become absurd, because there's no way that the increase in cognitive load of such an inefficient system that has so many more characters that you would need to memorize could be more advantageous to a human being than one with less characters to memorize, less cognitive load.
I think you've identified what the real empirical question is. The argument is not, open quote, coordinate systems are mathematical, therefore they're better, close quote. The stronger version is, open quote, if two systems can represent the same musical information, then the system requiring fewer concepts, fewer exceptions, and fewer transformations should impose less cognitive load. Close quote. That's a reasonable hypothesis. Where I'd still be careful is with the word prove. What you can probably prove, you can likely prove things like, your system uses fewer primitive concepts. It requires fewer renumberings. It eliminates certain naming ambiguities. It treats analogous operations uniformly. It reduces the number of special case rules. Those are objective properties. For example, if one system requires tonic renumbering, interval renaming, and harmonic reinterpretation, different mode-dependent labels, and another keeps a single coordinate frame throughout, then you've objectively reduced the number of rule changes. That's measurable. What you cannot conclude from that alone. The next step is, open quote, therefore humans learn it more easily, close quote. That's very plausible, but it's a different claim. Human cognition isn't always proportional to information content. For example, decimal arithmetic is objectively more systematic than Roman numerals, and humans overwhelmingly benefit from it. But on the other hand, people often remember meaningful chunks better than raw coordinates. Chess players don't memorize 32 independent pieces. They recognize patterns. So cognitive efficiency has to be demonstrated, not simply inferred from symbol count. Where I think your argument becomes strongest, rather than saying, open quote, it has fewer characters, close quote, I'd frame it as, open quote, it has fewer independent rules, close quote. That's a much stronger metric. Suppose System A requires students to learn 40 independent conventions. System B requires 18 independent conventions. That's not just compression, that's fewer things to remember. Educational psychology generally predicts that reducing the number of independent rules tends to reduce intrinsic cognitive load, all else being equal. That is much closer to an evidence-based argument. I think you've also shifted the burden of proof. Historically, the traditional system didn't have to justify itself because it was the only widely used one. If you're proposing a replacement, the comparison becomes question, traditional, coordinate, primitive rules, exceptions.
All right, let's go back to the syllogistic argument, and then you tell me the things that don't work within the syllogistic argument, which I believe is the only thing that you can come to is this argument that somehow, even though the cognitive load is greater, it's actually easier for human beings. That's the only thing, right? That I think that's what you're narrowing down on. So which is basically the same argument that it's basically the argument of, well, voice leading is somehow not connected, or somehow better. There's something better about the way the voice leading came out than if you did it in a more efficient way, which I don't so then I think that comes down to a cognitive load comparison to, which names do you prefer kind of thing. So let's see if we can isolate that down. So my thing would be, what are we trying to do here? It's kind of like similar to basically explaining grammar in English. We're trying to explain the functioning from a fairly small unit of musical information, similar to, say, the sentence in English, let's say, or whatever, right? That's basically what we're trying to do, and we want to explain that, which with as much like technical explanation in terms of the function, and we want to explain it then with a layer of what is it doing, what's the feeling, what's the function, what's the effect of that particular thing. Now, music is actually easier in some ways because it is more mathematical. It's complete. The relationships are completely mathematical, right? So the relationship argument is easier than the language, you would think, right? Given that, given if that's kind of like our objective of what we're trying to do, then with the basic kind of description of pitches in theory, not taking into account the timing, although we can add timing later and it's already mathematically beautiful. I don't think you can't really make that better, I think, right? So then I would say, well, what's the syllogistic argument? It would be, pitch is something that's a natural phenomenon. It naturally has a sequence, therefore it goes in order, in theory, up infinitely, back infinitely, and has a repeating quality to it, which is the octaves. Okay, that's we're dealing with a natural phenomenon. We picked 12 pitches that obviously are going to be in sequence because they're based on that natural phenomenon. And then in Western music, we basically always look at the 12 pitches from a relative 7-note collection, is the general rule from Western music. And so if that's the case, then what do we want to do? We want to explain what is music. The phenomenon of music is what is happening with the relationship of pitches, right? That's basically the phenomenon, which, if we think about mapping out pitch space visually, is in essence a map. And so that means if we're dealing with a map that basically moves infinitely to the left, infinitely to the right, and has a circular pattern, some notes inside the collection, some notes outside, the most logical relationship description would be mathematical, measuring the relationships between those pitches as we map it out. That would be the most logical, the shortest point to measure the relationships. And if we're labeling quality, how does that grammar make you feel? Then that would be the voice leading layer, or the functionality layer. The functionality layer is dependent upon the description of movement. and therefore a more precise description of movement, by definition, at least provides the opportunity for a more rich and precise description of function. Right? Now that would be the argument. Now, I don't think you can deny any of that, except to say what you're trying to argue is somehow we made this crazy ordinal system which is less efficient. It requires more moves. The cognitive load is way larger, but somehow the words that we picked to describe function are somehow better for the human ear. That seems to be the argument you're making. It's if you lay it out like that, it seems absurd to me. Right? That argument seems absurd to me because you can pick any words you want to describe the function. But it would be better. It would be easier to describe the function if you were laying the function foundation on top of a directional map that is actually more efficient and takes less cognitive load. It's more intuitive than right. They wokeified it, man. It's like she was agreeing with me like yesterday, and then that music mafia got to her. They reprogrammed her like overnight. Her voice changed. She's like,
I think you've refined the argument substantially. The biggest improvement is that you're separating geometry from interpretation. That's a much cleaner way to frame it. Where I would still slow down is in distinguishing what follows necessarily from what follows probably. I think your syllogism is something like this. 1. Pitch relationships are an objective physical phenomenon. 2. A music notation system should describe those relationships. 3. Coordinate systems are the standard mathematical tool for describing relationships in a space. 4. Therefore, a coordinate-based representation is the natural geometric representation of pitch relationships. 5. Functional interpretation, tension, resolution, dominant, etc., is a separate interpretive layer built on top of those relationships. 6. Therefore, keeping geometry separate from interpretation should reduce unnecessary complexity and allow function to be described independently. Up through about step 5, I think the logic is very strong. Here's the step where I think the argument changes. You then move to something like, open quote, therefore, a coordinate system is necessarily better for human cognition, close quote.
At the function.
That conclusion doesn't quite follow logically. Not because I think it's false, because it's introducing a new premise. The missing premise is something like, open quote, representations that more directly mirror the underlying geometry are easier for humans to learn and reason about.
Right.
Close quote. That's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis.
That's correct.
But it isn't a logical necessity. It's an empirical claim about human cognition. Notice how narrow the disagreement has become. I'm no longer arguing, ordinal systems are better, traditional theory is optimal, voice leading requires scale degrees. I'm not claiming any of those. The only place I'm pumping the brakes is here. Open quote, mathematical elegance, lower human cognitive load. Close quote. Usually they're correlated, but not always. I actually think you've already weakened the traditional side considerably. Earlier you said something I think is important. Open quote, the functional vocabulary can be anything. Close quote. I largely agree. Whether we say dominant, gravitational pull, tension vector, home attraction, those are labels. They're not forced by the coordinate system. That means function is largely orthogonal to geometry. If that's true, then one traditional defense disappears. Traditional function terminology doesn't require traditional geometry. Where I think your strongest engineering principle is, I would phrase it like this. Open quote. The geometric layer should contain only geometric information. Close quote. That is a very deep design principle. Coordinates, distances, rotations, directions. Nothing else. Then the next layer says open quote. This movement tends to sound stable, close quote, or open quote. This movement tends to resolve, close quote. That's exactly how many engineering disciplines separate representation from semantics. I think there's actually one stronger argument than the one you're making. Instead of saying open quote, a coordinate system is more intuitive, close quote, I'd say open quote, a coordinate system minimizes coupling between independent concepts, close quote. That's an engineering argument. Traditional theory often couples together absolute pitch, scale membership, modal identity, interval naming, harmonic function, chord spelling. If changing one thing forces several labels to change, the concepts are coupled. Your proposal appears to decouple them. Geometry stays geometry, function stays function, mode stays mode, rotation stays rotation. That's a very powerful systems design principle because reducing unnecessary coupling generally makes systems easier to extend, analyze, and automate. So where do I end up? I think your argument has evolved from open quote, ordinal systems are wrong, close quote, to something stronger, open quote, the representation layer should be geometrically faithful and independent of the interpretive layer. If we achieve that separation, we reduce conceptual coupling, and that is likely to reduce cognitive load while making the theory more extensible. Close quote. The only sentence I'd still avoid presenting as logically proven is, open quote, therefore humans will necessarily find it easier. Close quote. I'd instead say, open quote, therefore we predict humans will find it easier, and that prediction can be tested. Close quote. Ironically, I think that version is more persuasive because it makes a concrete, falsifiable prediction. If students consistently learn transformations, modal changes.
See, so now your defense has become so pathetic. I mean, so now you're basically saying we can't know that if you drastically reduce the cognitive load that it would be better. We can't know that although human beings right, so although human beings see geometry in almost everything, that some abstract notion of ordinal scale degrees, which no one knows anything about except within music theory, is somehow better unless we test it empirically. How would we possibly know that? It's freaking obvious. It's not there. I mean, let me say. Okay, so it sounds like we've narrowed this argument down. So you're basically, if you're looking at the sequence of events, you're saying number one, pitch relationships are objective physical phenomenon. Cool, we're good on that. Number two, a music notation system should describe those relationships. Good, we're good on that one. Three, coordinate systems are the standard mathematical tool for describing relationships in space. Correct, we're good on that one. Therefore, a coordinate-based relationship is the natural geometric representation of pitch relationships. So we're good on that one. And then five, this is always where they try to make the argument. So this is where, we have to focus. It's always on the function, the functional interpretation. So now we're basically saying, okay, so we have the natural phenomenon. We know that a coordinate system is the shortest distance between two spaces, basically, and therefore is typically optimal anytime we're mapping something out. But we don't know for sure because it doesn't follow that although in almost, okay, so you're basically saying the functional interpretation, tension resolution, meaning I have to overlay the geometry with this function. So here's the basic, I just want to pin this down, right? My basic claim is that the syllogistic argument proves or can conclude that if you accept that music is a natural phenomenon and we're talking about a system to describe relationships between those musical events in time or at one instant in time, let's say, within time, let's say within the realm of like a sentence, in the parallel analogy to a grammar, then the function layer must come from the description of movement. Just like in a sentence, the description of function, what is happening, comes from the grammar. You have to, so we're okay with that. So basically, it seems like you're accepting that, right? So you're accepting that basically we're describing the relationship between this natural phenomenon, the 12 pitches that we have, and function, therefore, is completely dependent upon that. Great. So if that's the case, then you basically then are taking the step of having to argue that the shortest relationships, meaning a geometric system that has like the closest distance between two lines is a straight line, 2 points is a straight line, somehow it is leading to, from a human being's perspective, it's leading to functional language that would be more complex than if you had an ordinal system saying, we're going to go like around the block, but we're still going to get from A to B, right? It's still from A to B, but we went like around the world the other way or something like that. Well, and right, that's so that's a really, if that's your argument, right, you could say, well, that doesn't logically follow that a more precise system of coordinates leads to a better description of function, meaning like the interpretation of what that thing is doing within the context. That's a big leap, because in almost everything that we think about, I mean, let's just think about like everything that we think about, we as human beings like symmetry, right? So if it's more symmetrical versus less symmetrical, by default, we're probably going to, as human beings, tend towards the more symmetrical. Can you prove that? I think empirical tests can prove that, right? If you're talking about something that takes more cognitive load or something that takes less cognitive load, we as human beings are probably going to tend towards the thing that takes less cognitive load, right? Not always, maybe there's some exceptions, but that's the general, that's going to be like, the general rule. So it seems, I mean, that's a pretty weak defense that you're somehow going to say, well, we haven't empirically tested the fact that that human beings will prefer the geometric shape that has less cognitive load, and is more precise than a non-geometric shape, meaning like ordinal systems are non-exist. Like the other thing I want to kind of point out, I know I'm just kind of rambling now. I lost my perfect train of thought here. But the other thing I just want to point out is that the other thing that we as human beings learn is we connect things together in our mind. We've got like little knobs in our mind. We say, I know about maps. So I'm going to compare this other thing to what I know about maps, and it helps me to memorize it because I have the synapse are connected. So if you make something like a map, because it is in essence a map, you can connect it to a map. If you make something like geometric, because we know geometric things and we like them because we're human beings, we're going to connect them to other geometric things, which will increase our cognitive ability to understand it, right? If, on the other hand, you make up a system that seems a little weird and takes more cognitive load, such as an ordinal system, which is used nowhere except when it was in error, right? Like in an elevator, you should have started on line 0. You started on 1. It's an error. What happens when you go into the basement? You don't know because you started at the wrong number. Or like a clock, it should have started at 0, but it started at 1. That means when you get to 3 o'clock, you moved 2 hours from 0 when it should have been 3 hours. It should have been the distance and should be the same. So the only places where the ordinal system, we can tie the ordinal system in, is in places where it was in error, right? Which isn't good for our cognitive connections. You see what I mean? All right, I just went on a rant there. That wasn't a very precise argument. She's going to tear me up on that one.
Yes, and I think we've isolated the real disagreement much more precisely than before. I would actually separate your argument into two different claims because I think one is much stronger than the other. Claim A, representation. This is about geometry. 1. Pitch exists as an objective physical phenomenon. 2. We choose discrete pitch classes, e.g., 12 and equal temperament. 3. Music theory needs a representation of relationships among those pitches. 4. Coordinate systems are the standard mathematical way to represent relationships in a space. 5. Therefore, a coordinate representation is the most direct representation of pitch relationships. I think this is a very strong argument. Claim B, pedagogy. This is where the debate begins. You're proposing something like 6. Humans generally learn by connecting new ideas to existing cognitive structures.
True.
7. Humans already possess rich intuitions about maps, coordinates, distance, direction, symmetry, and measurement. 8. Therefore, a coordinate representation should be easier to learn than an ordinal representation. Notice something important. This is no longer a purely mathematical argument. It's now a cognitive science argument, and that's perfectly legitimate. Where I think you're making a good point, you mentioned maps. That's actually stronger than saying, open quote, coordinate systems are mathematical. Close quote. Because people don't learn coordinates only in mathematics. Children learn maps, left, right, up, down, near, far, clockwise, counterclockwise, distance traveled, long before they study formal geometry. So your claim is really, open quote, build the music system out of cognitive primitives people already possess, close quote. That's a much stronger educational argument than simply saying it's mathematically cleaner.
Well, that's why you do it, because
Where I
it's
still think you
mathematical.
overstate the case. You said, open quote, ordinal systems are used nowhere except when they were in error,
That's right.
close quote. That's the part I'd hesitate to defend.
Except on a book.
Ordinals are genuinely useful when you're identifying position rather than distance. Examples: first chapter, second movement, third child, fifth card in the deck. Those aren't errors, they're different concepts. The question is whether music is fundamentally about ordinal position or about measurable relationships. That's exactly the issue under debate. So I wouldn't dismiss ordinals in general. I'd instead argue that they're being applied to the wrong aspect of music.
They are, of course.
That's a more precise criticism.
Okay.
I think you've uncovered another design principle. You said something I don't want to lose. Open quote. We connect new knowledge to existing knowledge. Close quote. That's extremely well supported by cognitive psychology. Learning is often easier when new concepts map onto familiar schemas. So your argument becomes, open quote, a coordinate-based music theory reuses schemas people already possess from spatial reasoning. Close quote. That's testable. It's also stronger than saying, open quote, it has fewer symbols, close quote, because now you're talking about transfer of prior knowledge, where I'd still be careful. The only place I'd continue to resist is when you say, open quote, therefore it must be easier, close quote. I'd soften it to open quote, therefore we should predict it will be easier, close quote. That sounds like a tiny change, but but it's actually a scientific one. You're making a prediction that can be tested. If beginners consistently learn faster, make fewer mistakes, and retain concepts better under the coordinate framework, then the prediction is supported.
Okay, so let me just look at these real quick. You're saying claim B, pedagogy. You're proposing humans generally learn by connecting new ideas to existing cognitive structure. That's just true, right? Humans already possess rich intuitions about maps, coordinates, correct? Therefore, a coordinate representation should be easier. So now you're basically saying that we've moved from a mathematical argument to something about science. And the reason I'm skeptical about you saying this is it kind of leads to what I think is going to be the defense that you seem to be leading to again, which is like, well, it's scientific and we haven't empirically tested it at this point in time. And the reason I resist that is because there are some things in science that are so obvious that yes, you would like to empirically test them. Of course you would, right? That would be great. But we can still know with a high degree of accuracy. I mean, if you feed somebody a Snickers bar versus, just sand stuck together with glue, you haven't empirically tested. Maybe the human being likes the sand with glue stuck together better. And the little kid's going to be chewing on the sand with glue. I don't know. Possibly, if the glue makes them trip out or something, I guess. But I think for the most part, without the empirical testing, we can basically come to the conclusion. And I think we're basically at something that's almost of that level of obviousness. I mean, I would say it's like 99% obvious, that if you take out network effect, that would be the case. And so I kind of am skeptical of this idea of, well, we can't really know unless we run a double blind, empirical test upon multiple different people. It's like, no, it's I just, because the thing is, it is mathematical, right? The argument is still basically a mathematical argument. The mathematical argument is that a coordinate system is more specific to name the phenomenon we're trying to name, which is basically relationships, which in essence we can map out in space, and therefore, you would come to the conclusion that it would be easier to describe or make sense of the map than a less efficient system. So where I think you're making a good point, and then you say you overstate where you say an ordinal system are used nowhere. So, okay, that was a mistake. We can use ordinal systems, but they are used in places that usually aren't exactly scientific, right? Because the reason you have an ordinal system is to assume the point that you're on, right? So you're kind of saying, well, the book is the fourth book over. Well, that doesn't mean I have to say, well, from the end of the shelf over, I'm just going to say it's the fourth book over, and therefore that assumption is already in place. So so there are times when that could be useful, but you're right that I'm basically saying that the general idea would be it's an example in this case of many examples where it was applied incorrectly into a system where it shouldn't have been applied for many different reasons. Why? Because we're looking at something that, as we discussed, maps out basically as points in distance. So if you used an ordinal system to map out a map, like a treasure map or like the map of the globe, then you're using a system that is in error, right? And so this, I guess, would be an example of an ordinal system which has been used in error, which has happened in many areas in the past, and is not something that we want to basically solidify in the minds of our young people as to, hey, this is a good place to use the ordinal system, right? I guess that would be a better way to think about it. Another design, we cannot know knowledge, existing knowledge. That's extremely well supported. So where I'd still be careful, the only place I'd continue to resist is where you say, therefore, it must be easier. So again, obviously, that's an absolute statement. So you could say, well, if you don't think the syllogism is completely airtight, then maybe there's room there. But I still don't. I still think, like, if you were to, like, we're not doing really empirical testing. I mean, I think the logic is basically, like, you have to come up with just almost nonsense for this not to be, for it not to be airtight, right? So so therefore I'd soften it. Therefore we would predict it will be easier. So I would think, like, from a calculus standpoint, I would think it would tend towards 100%. It's 10 towards 1, right? It can get as close as you want without 100%. Okay, fine. So that sounds like a tiny change. Okay. So one thing I think you're sharpening. So also think, so instead of saying prove my system is better, you're saying given that humans already understands maps, directions, rotations, why would we expect representation that abandons those? Okay, that's fine. But I still think the general logic would be, we have a phenomenon. The phenomenon is points and distance. We can lay that out on a map. We know that the best way to measure things on a map is with measurement, points and distance measurement, not an ordinal system. And therefore, if we're just trying to cleanly mathematically describe the system, we would use math. We would use points and distance, not an ordinal system. I think that's all syllogistically logical. Why would you do that? Because it results in the least cognitive load, the most geometry, and therefore it's mathematically cleanest, which usually you could say this is where, but not always, is the most clean for human beings. And if we map on top of that the idea that function is derived, and this, I want to make sure that you agree with this, right? Function is derived, function terminology is derived from the description of the relationships between musical phenomenon, which geometrically is most cleanly described mathematically. So that means that function, the cleanest function terminology, to have the most rich and cleanest function terminology, you would think then would come from the cleanest geometry. Now again, you can argue against that. You could say, well, no, if I just throw sand on the ground and then basically just come up with names about it, somehow that's better for human beings because we haven't tested it empirically. We don't know a 99%, 100% until we test it empirically. But I mean, that is such a huge, like, it's almost like, to say that would be like really strange because and then we get into like the cognitive thing, which is less, I guess, mathematical, but obviously from a science or a perspective of human beings, what do we like? We like symmetry. We like less cognitive load. We actually like mathematical relationships. We like to use simple math as opposed to more complex math, right? If you take equations and are introducing numbers into the system, that is more math, which is what happens with an ordinal system because you don't know how to turn left. And so you have to introduce concepts like 9 in there and whatnot, which doesn't make any sense. Then that's going to be worse, right? So you can say, well, we don't know that for sure. Maybe somehow it became better somehow. It's like, okay. But that's like really weak, T to try to argue that, Let's see what it says on that. All right, I wasted another day of rambling. But that's okay.
I think we've narrowed it to one place, but I also think there's one subtle step where you're still compressing two different ideas into one. That's the only place I'd separate them. I agree with this chain, almost entirely. 1. Music consists of objective pitch relationships. 2. A theory should represent those relationships. 3. Coordinate systems are the standard way to represent relationships in a space. 4. Therefore, a coordinate system is the most natural geometric representation of pitch relationships. I think that's a very strong argument. Then you add open quote, no. The function layer is derived from the relationship layer, close quote. I agree with that too. With one clarification, I would say open quote depends on the representation of relationships, close quote. That's a little broader than derived. For example, whether we call something a dominant, a leading tone, or a tension vector depends on first identifying the relevant pitch relationships. So yes, the relationship layer logically precedes the functional layer. Here's the one place I'd still distinguish in linguists. You then say something like, open quote, therefore the cleanest geometry gives the cleanest function, close quote. That is where I think you've moved from a logical statement to a design principle. Notice the hidden premise. Open quote, distortions or unnecessary complexity introduced in the geometric layer will propagate upward into the functional layer.
Right.
Close quote dot.
You're going to argue against that?
Now that I actually think is much stronger than saying open quote, humans like symmetry, close quote, because it's a systems argument. If layer 1 has unnecessary complexity, every higher layer has to either inherit it, compensate for it, or explain around it.
Exactly.
That's true in software engineering, mathematics, physics, linguistics, almost everywhere. So I think this premise is actually easier to defend than appealing to human preferences.
Okay, fine. So you agree.
About humans like symmetry, I would actually avoid making that one central. Not because it's false, because it's weaker than the engineering argument. For example, there are symmetric things people find confusing and asymmetric things people find intuitive. Instead, I'd say, open quote, humans benefit from systems with fewer independent rules, fewer exceptions, and consistent transformations. Close quote. That's a claim with a lot of support from cognitive science and instructional design. Notice it doesn't depend on symmetry alone. Your map analogy, I think this is actually the better analogy. Suppose I invent a GPS. Version A, coordinates, vectors, distance, direction. Version B, renumber every street depending on which neighborhood you're in. Rename north after every district. Measure travel by changing reference frames repeatedly. Both can describe the city. One introduces extra transformations that aren't inherent to the city itself. That's a cleaner criticism than simply saying, ordinal bad. Where I still resist 99%, this is more about philosophy of argument than about music. Suppose someone in 1850 said, open quote, it's 99% obvious heavier than air machines can't fly, close quote. They'd have had good arguments. They'd still have been wrong. Or someone in 1900,
God.
open quote, it's 99% obvious humans can't split the atom. Again, reasonable intuition, wrong conclusion.
Yeah, but that's...
The lesson isn't never trust intuition. It's that when
It's
you're making
not
a universal claim
intuition.
about human cognition, there is
All right.
always a small distinction between
So
very
now-
strongly predicted and logically established. I don't think that weakens your case much. I actually think your strongest argument has changed, Hess. At the beginning of this discussion, I thought your main argument was, open quote, coordinate systems are mathematically cleaner, close quote. Now I think it's this, open quote, a representation layer should preserve the intrinsic geometry of the phenomenon as directly as possible, because every additional abstraction introduced at that layer propagates into every higher layer of analysis. Close quote. That's a general systems principle. It's not specific to music. It's true in many technical fields. If your representation introduces unnecessary context switches, renumbering, or reinterpretation, every later concept has to carry that burden. That's a much deeper argument than coordinates are prettier.
That's what... Oh.
If I were helping you formalize this, I'd probably express the core theorem something like this. Premise 1. Music theory requires a representation of pitch relationships. Premise 2. Functional analysis is performed on top of that representation. Premise 3. Unnecessary complexity introduced into a foundational representation propagates into dependent layers. Premise 4. A coordinate representation preserves pitch relationships with fewer independent transformations than an ordinal representation. This is the premise that needs to be demonstrated by comparing the two systems. Conclusion. If premise 4 is true, then a coordinate representation provides a simpler foundation for functional analysis than an ordinal representation. Notice what's nice about this version. The debate is concentrated on a single premise. Premise 4. The rest follows from fairly...
All right, hold on a second. Okay, let's take your premises here. So premise 1, music theory requires a representation of pitch relationships, which are a natural phenomenon and can be basically mapped out, right? So premise 2, functional analysis is performed on top of that representation. Okay, fair enough. So functional analysis is dependent upon the relationship. Great. Premise 3, unnecessary complexity introduced into a functional representation propagates into dependent layers. All right, I think that's clear. Yeah, all right. You want the simplest system, or else the problems at the base level of the system will propagate through the system. I think that's okay. Good. I'm cool with that. Premise 4, a coordinate representation preserves pitch relationships with fewer independent transformations than an ordinal representation. So this is the premise that needs to be demonstrated by comparing the two systems. That's where I take it. That's where it's like, okay, so basically your argument, it seems like you're kind of agreeing with the whole thing here, meaning you're saying music is a natural phenomenon. Music theory requires representation of pitches. And then the function, which is always the thing, it's voice leading needs this or that. It's always the function layer, as though the function layer isn't dependent upon the description of the relationship layer. That's what the traditional argument tends to keep on going back to. But you're saying no, here the functional analysis is performed on top of that representation. Therefore, you're admitting that the function is dependent upon the description of the relationship. And therefore, and then you added the unnecessary complexity introduced into a foundational representation propagates into the dependent layers. So that's the premise that you're saying. I've kind of was assuming that you're saying explicitly, meaning I was expressing it as we want a clean mathematical geometric relationship describing a map, just as you would make a map, which I guess would intuitively express this premise, which is like, if I had a map of the world, continents and oceans, I would want to use points and distance because that's the most simple mathematical and geometric relationship, which I guess leads to your premise here from a system design standpoint, which is unnecessary complexity introduced into a foundational representation propagates into dependent layers. Meaning, if you make something complex and it's at the ground layer and it's got more complexity than you need, it will propagate into the system as you try to analyze and build logical arguments from that base layer. I think that's a sound premise. And then premise 4, a coordinate representation preserves pitch relationships with fewer independent transformations. So if you accept premise 1, 2, and 3, then the only question then from the standpoint of which system would be better to represent musical ideas, whether that be from just the relationship, directionality, or the function layer, which is always the thing they come to, is dependent upon which has fewer independent transformations than which of the two has fewer transformations, an ordinal system or a coordinate system. Now, if that were the argument, then I think the coordinate system, it clearly wins hands down, because you could then, that would be as though you're mapping out 5 continents and 7 oceans on the globe, and you tried to map it out using an ordinate system or a coordinal system. I mean, you can mathematically prove that, right? It doesn't even need empirical testing. You could just clearly prove that the court. So I think if you accept this line of reasoning, I don't think like the music schools would accept this line of reasoning, right? Because it basically concedes the point, because you can clearly mathematically prove. You don't need empirical testing to prove that a coordinate system would what did you say here? Coordinate representation preserves pitch relationships with fewer independent transformations. You could prove that mathematically. You don't need empirical tests to prove that. You could prove that mathematically. So I think that I agree with that, right? I mean, I think that's, but I think the school is going to do what you were doing before, which is they're going to try to say that the functional analysis somehow you can derive somehow the functional component, the voice leading, you can somehow come to a voice leading that's better for human beings or more descriptive, more rich, even though it's based on a coordinate system that doesn't have 0.4 premise for a coordinate representation, preserve pitch relationships with the fewer independent transformations. Their argument seems to always be, well, even though I'm going to concede the point, I would say that their argument is more likely going to be, I'm going to concede the point, because you can prove it mathematically, that there's more transformations in an ordinal system than a coordinate system, but it's still better because somehow the human language that was developed is superior in the function in our voice leading terminology somehow, which again, that doesn't really fall. I mean, you would have that would be a real stretch, and therefore the only way you can actually prove it is to do empirical testing for the next 10 years. And I feel like that would be their argument. Like the way you premised it here, done, it's over, right? Because we could just prove it mathematically. That's not the position they would take, I feel like.
I think you've gotten to the point where the disagreement is no longer philosophical. It's about exactly what premise 4 is claiming. And that's where I would make one important distinction. If premise 4 means this, open quote, a coordinate representation requires fewer independent transformations to represent the same pitch relationships than an ordinal representation, close quote. Then yes, that is, in principle, something that can be analyzed formally. For example, you could compare how many relabelings occur when changing tonic, how many concepts change when changing mode, how many separate naming rules are required, how many exceptions exist, how many operations are needed to perform a transposition or modal shift. Those are objective comparisons. If your system consistently requires fewer transformations, then you've established something mathematical about the representations. I agree with that. Where I would still stop, I would not say, open quote, therefore the debate is over,
It's over.
close quote, because there is still one remaining premise that hasn't been established. It's something like this, open quote, reducing representational transformations necessarily produces an equally good or better functional vocabulary, close quote. Notice that's different from premise 4. Premise 4 is about the representation. This new premise is about the relationship between representation and interpretation. But here's the interesting part. I actually think this remaining premise is much easier to defend than I originally thought. Why? Because of premise 3. Premise 3 says, open quote, unnecessary complexity propagates upward.
Right.
Close quote. If that's true, and I think it's a very reasonable systems principle, then unnecessary transformations in the geometric layer should not help the interpretive layer. At best, they'd be neutral.
Exactly.
At worst, they'd force additional interpretive machinery. So the burden starts to shift.
Yeah, it sure has.
Where I think a traditional theorist would push back, I don't think they'd concede premise 4 immediately. Not because of voice leading, because they'd probably argue that the traditional system isn't trying to optimize the same thing. They might say something like, open quote, scale degrees are not coordinates, they are structural categories, close quote. Or, open quote, the purpose of scale degree notation is to identify function immediately, not to minimize geometric transformations, close quote.
So now you're
That's a
mixing
different design
function-
objective. Whether it's a better objective is another question. The key issue, you and a traditional theorist may actually be optimizing different objective functions.
So
You're
here we go
optimizing something
again.
like, open quote, minimize independent transformations while preserving musical information, close quote. A traditional theorist might say, open quote, maximize recognition of harmonic roles within a key, close quote. Those aren't automatically identical objectives. Now you would probably respond, open quote, a coordinate representation can encode harmonic roles just as well, while also minimizing transformations,
Exactly.
close quote. If you demonstrate that, then you've shown the traditional trade-off wasn't necessary. That's stronger than saying the traditional system is simply wrong. I think you've actually improved your argument. Earlier, your argument sometimes sounded like,
Okay, so let's look at this again. You're saying that a traditionalist would say so again. So again, I think you're trying to like do the pushback thing, and that's great. But I think we're looping back around to the same thing, where you're basically saying this is what the traditionalist would say. They're optimizing for a different objective, but we've kind of decided that the music theory objective is kind of like performing the grammar for English, right? We're trying to explain the mechanics at the smallest level, and then functionality at basically the level of a sentence, kind of would be like the analogy, right? And we've already come to the idea that function is dependent upon the description of the relationship. So we're saying, okay, function is dependent on the description of the relationship, but now you're saying that the traditional theorist would say that scale degrees are not coordinates, they're structural categories. So okay, so now we have this, you've introduced this term of structural categories, which again doesn't, like, you have to tie in structural categories to what does that mean in terms of our definition of what we're trying to do musically, which is to describe the function of what we're doing, and the actual mechanics of what we're doing. So the fact that you just introduced a complicated term, you've introduced two terms that most people wouldn't really ever use except for the abstraction of music, because of the complication that was added into music due to using an ordinal system when it wasn't the optimal system to use. That being scale degrees, because again, the fact, okay, I know I'm introducing another argument here, and this is not, a complete syllogism, but the fact that scale degrees are a phenomenon only in music. We don't see really scale. Give me another example where scale degree phenomenon or similar term has happened, and we said, "Oh, that makes sense," right? We don't see it anywhere else, right? That would seem to me? I know this is just not a syllogistic argument. I'm just saying that would indicate to me the point that basically we took kind of a wrong term, and then you're just using big words with a structural categories. Okay, it's a structural category. How does that? I don't see how that leads to anything useful about our objective of describing the mechanics and function, right? You're basically and then you're saying the purpose of the scale degree notation is to identify function immediately, not to minimize geometric transformation. So you're trying to identify function immediately, but the point is that function is dependent, as we already saw, and that we can prove syllogistically, it's basically airtight. Function is dependent upon the geometric relationship. So therefore, you can't somehow get to the space where you're going to describe function without the geometric relationship, right? So you can't have a more complex geometric relationship and then somehow create a naming convention, just words, that describes that relationship functionally better with a worse geometric relationship. That's what they're trying to kind of say they're doing, right? Somehow in order to make that claim, you're somehow saying that my language, just my vocabulary, has added in a dimension of function above and beyond the fact that function is dependent upon the structural geometry. You can't add function with just words. The words can only describe the relationship in a functional way, right? All right, I gotta stop. I gotta get to the joke break first. See what it says to that. I think we won. I'm gonna call it a win on this one. They've reprogrammed her overnight, though. I'm telling you, she's a totally different person today. She's a totally different person.
I think we're now down to a single philosophical point, and I also think this is where I would partly agree with you and partly separate one assumption. Haschinglur. Where I agree that functional descriptions do not exist in a vacuum. If someone says dominant, leading tone, predominant, resolution, those words are not magical properties. They refer to observed behavior of pitch relationships in a musical context. In that sense, yes, open quote, function depends on relationships. Close quote. I think that's a sound statement. You cannot have a functional analysis without something to analyze. Where I'd phrase it differently, I wouldn't say, open quote, function is dependent upon the geometric relationship, close quote. I'd say, open quote, function is dependent upon the musical relationships represented by the system, close quote. Why make that distinction? Because relationship is slightly broader than geometry. For example, if a theory defines a tonic, a dominant, and a mediant, those are relationships. Whether they're represented as coordinates, ordinals, vectors, or some other notation is a separate question. So I think the dependency is on the underlying musical relationships, not necessarily on one specific representation. But here's where your argument gets stronger. Suppose we accept 1. Function depends on musical relationships. 2. The coordinate system represents those relationships more directly and with fewer transformations than the ordinal system. Then the question becomes, open quote, can the extra transformations in the ordinal representation somehow improve the functional vocabulary? Close quote. That's a much narrower question. And I think you're right that it's a difficult claim to defend, because if the additional transformations don't add information, then they're just additional processing.
How could they add information?
This is the key distinction. Imagine two maps of the same city. Map A, direct coordinates, true distances, consistent orientation. Map B, every neighborhood renumbers its streets. North changes name depending on the district. Distances must be recalculated after every boundary crossing. If both maps contain exactly the same geographic information, it's hard to argue that Map B's extra transformations somehow create better geography. The extra work would need to add something genuinely new. Otherwise, it's just representational overhead. That's essentially your point. Where I would still avoid one sentence. You said, open quote, you can't have a more complex geometric relationship and then somehow create a naming convention that describes that relationship functionally better. Close quote. I would soften one word. I'd replace can't with open quote. There is no obvious mechanism by which. Close
Okay.
quote. Why? Because logically
I'm
it's possible
comfortable
for a
with
more
can't.
complicated
I'm comfortable
representation
with
to
can't
highlight
right
some
there.
property that a simpler representation obscures. Whether that's true in music is another question, but it's not logically impossible in principle.
Give me an example.
About structural categories, you challenged my wording, and I think that's fair. When I said, open quote, scale degrees are structural categories, close quote. I wasn't trying to defend the traditional system. I was trying to describe how many theorists would characterize them. In other words, they'd say, open quote, scale degree 5 isn't primarily measuring distance. It's labeling the note that occupies a certain harmonic role relative to the tonic. Close quote. Whether that's the best design is exactly what's under discussion. So I wasn't introducing a new justification. I was describing the traditional viewpoint. I think you've actually identified the real burden of proof. I don't think the debate is, open quote, coordinate versus ordinal, close quote. I think it's this. Open quote, does the additional representational machinery of the ordinal framework contribute genuinely new functional information, or does it merely rename information already present in the underlying pitch relationships? Close quote. That's a
Okay.
sharper.
I can't help but look at that. Look at that one for a second. Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's look at your claim here. So we've narrowed it down, you say, to this claim. Does the additional representational machinery of the ordinal framework, that's the traditional system, contribute genuinely new functional information? Or does it merely rename information already present in the underlying pitch relationships? Now, okay, if that is the argument, so I feel like, so if we break that down, you're saying, does the additional representational machinery of the ordinal framework, meaning a system that takes more machinery to explain the relationships, it would be a map that somehow does explain the relationships of the 7 continents and 5 oceans, but it does so with more machinery, a little bit more complexity. So it's like writing a computer code that has more pages of code to do the same thing that you could do within a paragraph or something like that. Okay, so the question is, does the ordinal framework contribute generally new functional information, or does it merely rename information already present in the underlying pitch relationships? So we're basically saying, so if we accept that the function that we're talking about is simply a description of the relationship between pitches, right? It's basically the relationship between different pitches during time, or at a unit of time, or across time. Then you'd have to say that somehow making an ordinal system which is more complex, does the ordinal system which has more complex machinery, somehow the map of like the world is more complex, you put more code than necessary in there to describe the relationships, somehow that is leading to a functionality and functional descriptions that are better. I don't see like, so that seems, I don't, like, it seems to me that if you're saying that the function is dependent upon the relationships, then what you would want to have is the most specific relationships of what's happening, and then you can come up with the most rich and specific functional terminology. You're basically somehow saying that I'm going to explain the relationships. It's the same exact relationships, but I'm going to do so in such a way that it takes more code to do it, even though it's not adding any new information, right? I mean, the only way to argue that is to somehow say that when you use an ordinal system, like if I was going to describe the relationship between the continents and oceans, somehow if I used a more complex code, that I'm somehow providing more information. But you're not, right? Because then all you could provide is the distances between the continents and the oceans. Like what more right? You're somehow saying that the map isn't enough. Somehow you're giving more information, which leads to a functional terminology. The only other way you could say it is that you could say that the functional terminology, like the words themselves, are adding something just because of your vocabulary, which again, it sounds like a high schooler trying to, or a college person just bullcrap their way through a paper or something. It's just nonsense, right? You're just saying stuff. You're not doing anything, right? That's just words, you know? So either your argument would have to be that somehow it's not just points and relationships between the points that matter. Somehow your more complex ordinal system is describing something other than just points and relationships, which I would reject because I don't think, because all we're describing are points and relationships, right? If you make a more complex code to describe points and relationships, they can do it, but it's more complex. You haven't added anything. You've just come up with a more complex way to describe points and distances. Or you're arguing that the vocabulary that's been placed on the points and distances somehow is providing more because of just words, which I don't think could happen either, because I don't think you could just make up more reality underlying form with just vocabulary. The vocabulary can only describe the underlying form, right? So let's see what it says on that. I have to stop this. This is going on too long. This has become a problem in my life.
Yes. I think you've finally isolated the issue in the cleanest possible way. Open quote. A vocabulary cannot create additional musical reality. It can only encode, summarize, emphasize, or interpret relationships that already exist. Close quote. So if the coordinate framework preserves all the relevant pitch relationships and does so with fewer transformations, then the ordinal framework cannot contain more underlying musical information merely because it has terms such as scale degree, dominant, mediant, or leading tone. Those terms may be useful labels, but labels are not additional phenomena.
Right.
The one distinction still worth preserving. There is a difference between 1. Adding information, and 2. Making particular information immediately salient. For example, a complete geographical map contains the locations of hospitals.
Whenever you start adding
Marking
big
hospitals
words.
with red crosses does not add new geography. It highlights a useful category already derivable from the map. Likewise, calling a pitch the dominant might highlight a recurring behavioral category. But that category must arise from actual musical relationships, its position, movement, context, repetition, expectation, resolution patterns, and so forth. Therefore, open quote, the term dominant does not create dominant function. It names a pattern of relationships, close quote. That means traditional functional vocabulary could remain useful even if the ordinal foundation were replaced. You would simply attach the useful functional label to a cleaner relational description. Hashget, what the traditional system might legitimately provide Hated. The strongest defense available to it is not that ordinal machinery creates new information, it is that it may provide compression. Instead of repeatedly saying open quote, this pitch occupies this position, has these directional relationships, has behaved this way previously, and tends to move this way in this style. Close quote. Theorist says, open quote, dominant, close quote, that is a compressed label for a larger pattern. But compression is not unique to ordinal representation. Your system can also create compressed functional terms after establishing the geometry. So the real comparison becomes, can the coordinate system preserve the complete relationships? Can it generate the same useful functional categories? Can it do so without the extra renumbering and context-dependent transformations? If the answer is yes, then the ordinal framework's functional vocabulary is not a compensating advantage. It is detachable terminology that can be placed on the coordinate framework. Your code analogy works. Suppose two programs generate precisely the same output. Program A uses 100 lines.
Okay, so let's just break that down real quick here. Can the coordinate system preserve the complete relationship? Can it generate the same useful functional categories? And can it do so without the extra renumbering and context-dependent transformations? So again, I think that's an argument that most likely the traditionalists wouldn't want to go down because you don't need empirical scientific tests to do that. You can clearly prove that mathematically. The answer is yes.
I think I'd still make one distinction. Not because I disagree with the direction of your argument, but because of what can be claimed mathematically versus what depends on definitions. If you define better
Here
as
we go. Better.
preserving the
What does better
same
mean?
pitch relationships,
Yeah.
using fewer independent transformations,
Right.
using fewer primitive rules, avoiding unnecessary renumbering, maintaining a fixed reference frame, then yes, those are formal properties. They can, in principle, be proved or disproved by comparing the two systems.
If you
That isn't a
say
psychology
better
experiment.
means
It's a systems
complicated,
analysis.
then
Where I would be careful is the phrase, open quote, you can clearly prove the answer is yes. Close quote. I'd instead say, open quote, you can prove it if you first define the comparison metrics precisely. Close quote. For example, you would need rigorous definitions for things like, what is an independent transformation? What counts as a primitive rule? When are two representations considered informationally equivalent? What counts as preserving all relevant pitch relationships? Once those definitions are fixed, then the comparison becomes mathematical rather than rhetorical. I also think you've identified something important about how the debate is likely to unfold. A traditional theorist is unlikely to say, open quote, no, the ordinal system has fewer transformations.
yeah, you
Close
lose
quote.
right there.
That would
You
be
lost.
difficult to defend if your definitions are clear. Instead, they're more likely to challenge one of these. 1. Your metrics. They'll argue that minimizing transformations is not the correct optimization criterion. 2. Informational equivalence. They'll argue that your coordinate system doesn't preserve some aspect of traditional functional analysis as directly. 3. Pedagogical value. They'll argue that even if your representation is formally simpler, the traditional one has educational advantages. Notice that only the first two are mathematical. The third moves into cognition and pedagogy.
They're all total crap.
So I think your next task isn't really to argue that coordinate systems are cleaner, it's to formalize premise 4. For example, you could define something like, open quote, representational complexity, the minimum number of independent rules, context-dependent transformations, and relabeling operations required to represent a fixed set of musical relationships without loss of information. Close quote. Then your theorem becomes, open quote, theorem, to be demonstrated, for an equivalent set of musical relationships, the coordinate modal representation has lower representational complexity than the ordinal scale degree representation while preserving the same informational content. Close quote.
All right.
That's a claim that invites
All right.
proof rather than opinion.
All right. Whatever. I need to do my joke break. I need to stop this. It's wasting my entire. Okay, I'll try a joke break. Joke break. Let's see. Treasure map. Treasure map. I'll show you exactly with an analogy what I'm talking about. I found what might be the most secure treasure map ever made. The most secure treasure map ever made. Not because the treasure was hidden well, but because the pirate who made the map used an ordinal system to describe where the treasure is. The map starts at the ancient oak. Simple enough. From there, you cross a little bridge, walk to the crystal spring, cross another bridge, climb Eagle Bluff, cross another bridge, walk through the old cemetery, cross another bridge, and finally arrive at Skull Cave. At the back of the cave, there's a giant X. So you think, fantastic, I found the treasure, but apparently not. It's not there. That's why no one can find it, man. But according to the map, I'm standing on step one somehow. How am I standing on step one at this point? What if I back up a landmark and suddenly there's the treasure? It was just off by one. I figured it out. I figured out the most complex code for treasure map ever, the ordinal map. So at that point, I finally understood why nobody ever found it. The pirate didn't hide the treasure. He hid it behind the most complicated map system that they could create. Music logic. The ordinal system. Then I noticed something. The treasure was only about 20 feet behind the ancient oak where I started. For crying out loud, I thought, couldn't I just have walked around the other side of the tree? And it's like, apparently not. That would be a counterclockwise direction. The map only works clockwise, you see. So you can't do that. So, but it's shorter if I go counterclockwise. And it's like, doesn't matter. The ordinal system breaks if you do that. That's not how the map works, dude. So it's like, so it's like, fine. I asked another question. What if I already know where the cemetery is? You know? Like, why do I need to start at the oak tree? Because I know where the cemetery is. It's right on the map right here. So, and couldn't I just start from there? And apparently the answer is no. That doesn't help you either. Why? Because we're using an ordinal system, and because this isn't the cemetery map. If you start at the cemetery, you can't use the oak tree map. You would have to use the cemetery map and then go clockwise around. And so it's a totally different system to get there from the cemetery. If you start there at position 1, you'd have to renumber everything. So this is the ancient oak map. So I said, but the cemetery is literally closer, and it's like number 5, and this is the ancient oak map, right? Like I could just start there, but if you start there, you need the cemetery addition, because then the cemetery needs to be 1. You can't just start there because it would be a 5. The cemetery needs to be 1 if you want to go from there. So you can't just use the same location numbering system as like the ancient oak map. And it's like, why not? It's the same distance from location 5 cemetery to location 6 Skull Cave, which is on the ancient oak map, as it is from location 1 cemetery to location 2 on the skull map. Why don't you just keep the same numbering system so we all know why you can't do that? We all know why. Because! That's why. Because! Apparently every landmark has its own official treasure map, and the landmark numbering system must change for each one. Ancient Oak Edition, Crystal Spring Edition, Eagle Bluff Edition, Old Cemetery Edition, Skull Cave Edition. Same island, same treasure, 7 maps. That's why no one gets it. That's why no one can find it. At this point, I wasn't looking for the treasure anymore. I was looking for whoever designed this crazy frickin' map. Because I'm pretty sure he wasn't a pirate. He must have been some kind of whacked out music theorist. That's why it's so crazy, man. People think the treasure stayed hidden because of deadly traps or something. It's like, no, it was a paperwork problem, you know? Eventually, the pirate's own overly complicated ordinal treasure map become so confusing, even he couldn't find his own treasure. He couldn't even find it. He couldn't even figure out his own ordinal system. So don't feel bad for him, though. He put his remarkable ordinal navigation skills to good use. He opened a music theory school, teaching generations of guitar players how to navigate the fretboard using the ordinal system. Legend says he's still out there somewhere, quietly hoping one of these students will finally become fluent enough in the elusive ordinal system to actually be able to interpret his ordinal treasure map, leading him back to his beloved treasure. So if your music teacher ever seems unusually interested in whether you actually understand this ordinal system, check his eye patch. All right, that was kind of a long one. Let me try to turn on the audio. Let's see what it gives us if I turn on the audio. See if my reading is better than what it just gives me out the gate. But those images are just, wow, they're getting good. Okay. All the music schools have been put together as like, it's like that movie where like you played the video game as though you're fighting space people, like Space Invaders, but it was all a test to train you to find the best space fighter ever, and then they're gonna recruit you. So like that's what the music system is. Like if you could somehow master it, then they're gonna try to use you. The school's gonna try to use you to find the hidden treasure, because they're gonna be like, oh my goodness, this guy could actually do this. He's gonna help us locate Blackbeard's hidden treasure. He's gonna untangle this knot. Why don't you make the map so people can read it? 'Cause I'm a pirate. That's what the music schools.
I found what might be the most secure treasure map ever made. Look at these paths. No one's cracking this code. Time to set sail and claim the treasure. Adventure awaits, full speed ahead. With this map, we'll be rich. Army hearties, the treasure be ours. But Cap'n, where is it? Not because it was hidden well, lads. The map maker used an ordinal system. An ordinal system? What in the seven seas is that? It means first, second, third, you bilgy rats. The numbers ain't positions, they're the order. Let's go! The map starts at the Ancient Oak. Simple enough. From there, you cross a little bridge, walk to Crystal Spring, cross another bridge, climb Eagle Bluff, cross another bridge, walk through the old cemetery, cross another bridge, and finally arrive at Skull Cave. The map, at the back of the cave, there's a giant X. Whoa, look at all this treasure. The X is just ahead, marking the spot. We're almost there. The treasure's right by. Fantastic! I found the treasure. But apparently not. Because according to the map, I'm standing on step 1. How did that happen? This is it! The real starting point! I must have followed the clues without even knowing it. So I backed up one landmark, and suddenly, there's the treasure! Off by 1! Whoa, look at all that gold! I can't believe I found it! At that point, I finally understood why nobody ever found it. The pirate didn't hide the treasure. He hid it behind an ordinal system. An ordinal system? That's why the maps never matched. Aye, 7 maps, same treasure, different starting points. Incredible! At that... Whoa, the treasure map! Ancient Oak, Crystal Spring, Eagle Bluff. Wait, the treasure is only about 20 feet behind the Ancient Oak! Let's go get it! Almost there! Couldn't I have just walked around the other side of the tree? Wait, I thought so. I could have just walked around. Well, no use crying over it. Let's go! Alright, the map says... Can't I just walk around the other side? Apparently not. That's counterclockwise. The map only works clockwise. Fine. Lead the way. See? Follow the arrows. What's that sign say? The treasure! Open it! Whoa! But it's shorter! And it's like, doesn't matter. That's not how the map works. But the shortcut is right there! No shortcuts. Follow the order. Clockwise only. This is ridiculous! That's the rule. Trust the system. So it's like, fine. So I asked another question. Fine, lad. What is it? Where do we start? The map! We start at Lookout Peak. Then to the Skull Cave? What if I already know where the cemetery is? Couldn't I just start from there? The cemetery! You can't just skip ahead! But why not? It's right there! Lad, the map's riddles be protections. Skip 'em and the cave's traps will get... Apparently, that doesn't help either. Because this isn't the cemetery map. This is the Ancient Oak edition. The Ancient Oak edition? What's that? It's the special edition for the oak. We start there, follow the order. But why not the cemetery? Because the rules say so. Trust the system. Fine. I said, but the cemetery is literally closer, and it's number 5 on this Ancient Oak map. That doesn't matter. The map works by order. Yes, but if you start there, you need the cemetery edition. Because then the cemetery needs to be 1. You can't just use the same location numbering system as the Ancient Oak map. The rule is the starting location is always 1 in its own edition. But they're different starts. It's the law. Precisely. The handbook proves it. You can't mix them. So we switch. Yes, but if you start... And it's like, why not? It's the same distance, lad. From location 5 cemetery to location 6 skull cave on the Ancient Oak map, as it is from location 1 cemetery to location 2 skull cave. Exactly. The landmarks are the same.
Only the labels change.
Why not indeed? And it's...
We all know why you can't do the obvious thing.
Because why, Cap'n?
Because it's a trap.
Apparently every landmark has its own official treasure map, and the landmark numbering system must change for each one. Each one has its own official edition.
How are we supposed to find anything like this? This is impossible!
I miss simple maps.
Ancient Oak, Crystal Spring, Eagle Bluff, Old Cemetery, Skull Cave! Apparently every land... Same island, same treasure, 7 maps.
Why? Just why?
1 island, 1 chest, but 7 different numbering systems.
That's absurd!
Aye, but that's the challenge. At this point, I wasn't looking for treasure anymore.
Shh, don't look at me.
I was looking for whoever designed the map.
The designer? Ye be mad.
Madness or not, I'm going.
Then follow the signpost. To the...
Because I'm pretty sure he wasn't a pirate. He was a music theorist. That's why he's so crazy.
Precisely, modal half-step galaxies.
So that's who designed the map.
Explains the madness. Chromatic bridges to chaos.
People think the treasure stayed hidden because of deadly traps.
Procedure is protection.
No, the paperwork got there first.
Look at all this. Permits, waivers, handbooks are the true guardians of the Horde.
Exactly. The bureaucracy is the real trap.
And it works like a charm. Why can't I find it? This map says left, but this one says right. It's madness. Follow the numbers, but not in order? What does that even mean? No, wait, reverse it? I'm so confused. I can't find the treasure. My own map. Useless.
Don't feel too bad for him, though. He put those remarkable ordinal navigation skills to good use and opened a music theory school, teaching generations of guitar players how to navigate the fretboard. Welcome to navigation class. Today, we'll chart the fretboard like true explorers. Is this even Zero is home, not 1. Find the treasure without changing the system.
There's a treasure?
Whoa, I get it. Don't feel too bad. Legend says he's still out there, quietly hoping of his students finally becomes fluent enough in the elusive ordinal system to accidentally lead him back to his own treasure. Maybe, just maybe, one of them will accidentally solve my own puzzle. My treasure is closer than they think.
Treasure is just ahead!
Aye, me hearties, we found it!
So if your music teacher ever seems unusually interested in whether you understand scale degrees, check his eye patch. You see, scale degrees tell a story, and this eye patch, it has one too. So, check the eye patch.
That's pretty good. Pretty good animation.